All right, so welcome to chapter 6 of the ggplot book, which is looking at mapping in ggplot. So for today, what we are going to learn about is how to plot very simple maps using geom-polygon, using the simple features type object SF to plot GIS data, using geom-SF, how to work with the map projections, and the underlying SF data structure, as well as how to draw maps using raster data. So this chapter is pretty package intensive in terms of packages required outside of just ggplot2. So I just added a list here of all the packages that I had to install. Have to move stuff out of the way of the arrows. Here we go. All right, so plotting geospatial data in general is just a really common visualization task, but it does require specialized tools. And basically what you can do is you can sort of break down the problem of plotting geospatial data into two smaller problems. One is using a data source to draw a map. And the second is adding metadata from another information source to the map. And this could be things like, in this chapter, we saw capital cities. It can be things like observations of animals, different like cities and animals are currently the only thing I can think of, but there's a lot of other things that you could definitely do. So we start off looking at basically the simplest way to do this, which is drawing maps using geom-polygon. And for this data set, we use a base R data set that looks at, my cat is being weird. We're looking at different counties in Michigan in this particular example. So we've got our map data, we extract out the counties in Michigan, do a little bit of data transformation, and we get this data set that essentially has a bunch of different points with the longitude and latitude, as well as some contextual information like the county name and what subregion they are a part of. So we've got longitude, which will be our X variable in a minute, latitude, which will be our Y variable in a minute. ID is the name of the region, and the group is a unique identifier for contiguous areas within a region, which they might mean something to somebody who's from Michigan or is somebody who's more familiar with this data set, but I am not really sure how the group, in this case, how it differs from the ID. So in terms of plotting a polygon map, essentially what you're doing is you're giving a bunch of points that are different nodes between boundaries, basically. So you can sort of start to visualize this by looking at, by just plotting it as point data. And you can see here we have the shape of the state of Michigan, as well as the number of points in between, which are going to represent the points sort of demarcating the edges of different counties. In order to make this look like an actual map, what we will want to do is use the geom-polygon function, which makes this look very much like an actual map. You can see that we've got still the shape of Michigan, but within the actual state, we're actually seeing borders between the different counties. You can see that we are filling these borders with white, and then also specifying the color of the borders there. One thing to note is that in both of these plots, we are using Cohort quick map, which is basically adjusting the axes to ensure that longitude and latitude are rendered on the same scale. And what we're going to do next is we're going to look at sort of more advanced uses of ggplot, which are more realistic and probably more likely to be the use cases that people are going to want to use. Doing this polygon is really great if you are, just trying to whip something up really quickly, but there's a lot of oddities that go into plotting geospatial data that doing a simple polygon really does not account for. So basically this longitude latitude format where you just have like an X and a Y value isn't really practical for real world applications. And we'll sort of get into why that is the case in a minute. But because of this sort of inadequacy for real world applications, most vector data for maps are written using a standard called Simple Features, which is produced by the Open Geospatial Consortium. So in order to explore simple features, what we're going to be doing is we're using a package called OzMaps by Michael Sumner, and it provides maps for a number of different levels of Australian geography. So we've got state boundaries, local government areas, electoral boundaries, and even more stuff that we're not really looking at here. So if we look at our OzMaps data and extract specifically the states, we can see that this is an object called a simple feature collection. There's a whole bunch of different data here telling us what the geometry type is, whether it's in 2 or 3 dimensions, and a bunch of different things that we will learn more what they mean later. And if we sort of look into this, what is contained within this SF collection is a tibble that has all of the different states or are they states or regions? Yeah, they're states of Australia as well as the territories. And then there is a column that is very intriguingly called geometry and just has a bunch of numbers representing different points. So this geometry column is the most important column in a simple features object. It specifies the spatial geometry, so here of the states and territories. And it's basically taking what we would have in the polygon example of the polygon example, and instead of having to have many different rows for a single county, for example, we would actually have just one row for the county, and it would have all of the different points specifying the boundaries in this geometry column. In this particular example, each element is a multi-polygon. You can see that specified right under the name of the column. And basically what a multi-polygon is just saying that within this geometry category, there may actually be more than one polygon. And this allows us to get complex shapes. Like in the Australian example, we have a state that contains like its own sort of contiguous, like basically Washington, DC type situation. We also have a number of states that have a bunch of islands. So these need to be represented by multiple polygons. So we'll make a very simple features plot here. We take our Australian states data, we put it into ggplot, we run geom.sf and cohort SF, which will give us our coordinates, and we get a map of Australia. Very nice. So what's happening sort of under the hood here is that geom.sf is relying on that geometry column that we just looked at. And this geometry column is special. It's not used anywhere else in ggplot, only really when you're looking at an SF plot. The geometry column itself, or what is, I guess what I should say is the geometry column is becoming an aesthetic in the geom.sf. And we can specify that geometry aesthetic in multiple different ways. So the simplest case, which is the case that we did here, where we basically put 0 input other than the data set we were using, is that geom.sf will attempt to map the geometry aesthetic to a column name geometry. So if you have a column name geometry, you're good to go. You don't really need to do any extra futzing about. If the data argument is an SF object, which it is in this case, geom SF can also automatically detect a geometry column, even if it's not called geometry. So in our Oz states example, we could call that geometry column super fun time, and it would still be able to detect that that's a geometry. The last thing is you can actually do this manually. You can specify the aesthetic geometry equals whatever your column name is. This is really useful if you have an SF object that has multiple geometry columns. I don't know if anybody has any ideas off the top of their head of when that would be the case. I couldn't really think of any. Obviously, there are use cases, or else this wouldn't be mentioned. I guess if you had, I mean, maybe you could have different geometries for, like, you could have a line for a country and then different geometries for like different counties, or I don't know.
The only example that I can think of, but I have never used this, but I imagine that, for example, if you have with the census data and you have, but I think they work it differently, but this is a way that you can also have this. So let's say you have a row is a block, a census block, and then in 1 year, that census block had this geometry.
Yeah.
And then let's say 5 years later, that geometry changed because, with the gentrification and all of that, then that polygon is no longer available, it's no longer viable. So then you use another one. So then you have multiple geometry columns per year. So it's geometry 2000, geometry 2005, geometry 2010, or something like that. I don't think they manage it like that, but that's a way that you could do it. But that is because you want to preserve the identity of the row. So then each row, which is a census block, so that one has a name, census block 1, census block 2. The other example that I can think of is if you have, again, if you have plots and you're doing like experiments and you have different plots, but then for whatever reason, you moved one of those plots between seasons or something because, I don't know, something happened and you had to move it, but you want to preserve the name of that plot for whatever reason. And then you again have geometry for year 1 and geometry for year 2. That's another way that I can think of. But again, I manage it differently. I have never, because I didn't think you could have different geometries. What I do is I rename my plots. So then it becomes plot number 45 or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's the only example I can think of, Ashley. This is interesting.
Yeah. I think the case of changing boundaries is a good one. I mean, I could think of, I guess you could think of like disputed territories too. Like if you have a territory that some people consider to be one country and others consider it to be 2 countries, you could kind of have like country with and without the disputed territory, I guess.
Yeah, that's another example. Yeah. The other thing that I can think of is if you have what do you call this thing? Tracking data, because you put trackers on your animals, so that then you have again the geometry for 1 year, but you have the same individual that you capture on season 1, and then you capture it again on season 2, and then you have the geometry, different geometries for each, and you want to preserve the identity again of the row, right? The identity of the individual. So this was like bird 1, bird 2, or something, instead of doing it stacked, which is how I usually do it. But yeah, so I guess, it's interesting to know that you can have different geometry columns. I guess it's a good mental exercise, right? To start thinking about different ways of plotting your data. This was interesting.
Yeah. So another thing that you can do is you can overlay maps on top of each other. And this is because ggplot2 supports adding multiple GMSF layers to a single plot. So in this example, we take our map of our Australian states, which gives us sort of the general map of Australia that we had before. And then we also have our electoral districts, and we can sort of superimpose our electoral districts on top of our Australian states and territories map. And basically what's happening here is we are coloring the map by the states. So all of these colors are indicating the state, and then you can see we have basically a transparent additional layer of just the electoral districts, which is adding all of these sort of lines within the state boundaries. We can also label our maps. So if we have all of our names of the different electoral districts in Sydney, we can then pull out just those labels and show everybody what all of the different electoral districts in Sydney are called. I think one thing I would have potentially appreciated would be having the annotations or labeling chapter before this chapter, just to help facilitate the explanation here. But one thing to note is that you will get a warning if you are using latitude and longitudinal data, and the text goes into detail on why this is, but it's one of those cases where it's a useful warning to have, but in this particular case, it doesn't really matter. And honestly, I forget what the specifics of what the explanation were. Another fun thing, and this is where the real utility of plotting maps in R really comes into this is where the utility of plotting maps in R really shines, is that you can add other geoms. So this is where you can start to add the metadata about the map that you are projecting. So in our case here, we've got a table of all of the capital cities of the different states of Australia. And what we do is we have our SF geom, we plot our map, and then we add as points all of those capitals. So basically you can see all of the capitals are pretty much distributed along the coast in Australia. Other use cases for that, I mean, I'm sure we can all think of really fun use cases. I mean, you could do something like this. Maybe you could add a size component, and you could show how the population size of the different capitals differ. In the sort of ecological data, this would be a map with observations, so showing where all of your different specimens came from. I've done this to demonstrate that a new fossil specimen that we found was way further north than any of the other ones had been documented before. So lots of different use cases here. Now we get into the things that make plotting map data a little bit interesting and more complex than on the surface, it seems. If you're just doing a really quick visualization, you probably don't have to think too much about these, but if you're trying to do anything sort of really scientific, really rigorous, you're going to have to think about a lot of weird stuff. So the first is the geodetic datum, and this is basically a set of assumptions about how the Earth is shaped. We often think of the Earth as a sphere, but it is a ellipsoid with a lot of funkiness going on. And because of this, there are a lot of geodetic data that you can choose from. what will work best depends on your use case. I've highlighted here the World Geodetic System, or WGS 84, just because it's the one that is most commonly used if you're looking on a global scale. But there are geodetic data for specifically for North America. The example that we were looking at in Australia had their own lots of specifics. You also have to select a map projection. And essentially what this is choosing what distortions you're willing to accept. Because inherently the process of taking Earth, which is an ellipsoid, and trying to map that sort of spherical shape is, and mapping it to a plane, like your screen, you are inherently introducing distortions. There's no way for you to map that shape without making things look a little bit funky. So basically your map projection is an explicit choice about where your distortions are going to occur and what they are distorting. So basically you're trying to figure out what geometric properties you want to preserve. Yes.
This is the tricky part. Yes.
Yeah. So did you hear me finish talking about the map directions?
Yes, I think that's where we stopped. You were starting to talk about CRS. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So the coordination reference system, or CRS, is a full set of assumptions used to translate longitude and latitude into a 2D map. So this is going to include the geodetic datum, the map projection, and any additional parameters of the projection, like the location of the origin. So your CRS is pretty much like the most important thing for dealing with SF data. Usually you're not going to be necessarily indicating the datum and the map projection separately. You're probably just going to pick a CRS and go with it. But the question then becomes, how do you tell R what CRS you're using? And there's a couple different ways to do this. In the book, they talk about well-known text, which is a text markup language for representing vector geometry objects on a map, spatial reference systems of spatial objects, and transformations between spatial reference systems. This is not a phrase that I had heard before. But usually the way that we do it here is the EPSG code, and this is just a numeric code that indicates a specific CRS. There's also the Proj for spatial, which they talk about later in the book but never define, and I hadn't had a chance to look it up. But I believe it's just a named way to refer to a CRS. So next we're going to talk a little bit about working with SF data. This is an extremely cursory look, and there are entire books on dealing with SF data. And a good way to start looking into working with SF data is by just looking at the SF package help file. And then there's also Geocomputation in R, is a book that goes through how to do a bunch of geospatial things. One thing that I thought would be particularly useful to note for people who are reading this chapter, it is mentioned in the chapter, but it's sort of like buried at the end in the like references or the data sources bit, is that you can import your own shape files. So you can import your own geospatial information. You don't have to rely on packages that already have those data. So if you have a shape file, which is a .shp, you can load them into R with the SF function readsf. If you extract the geometry column in an SF object, there's a number of things that you can learn. So you can learn its type, the type that you'll probably most commonly see in the one that we saw in the Australia example is multi-polygon, which, as we talked about, is just multiple polygons all lumped into one sort of geometry package. You can also look at ST dimensions or ST dimension, which extracts the number of dimensions in the geometry column. In our Australia example, it was 2 dimensions, so we only had X and Y values. We didn't also have Z values. Z values would be things like elevation. You can have ST box, which extracts the bounding box for the geometry as a numeric vector. This can be really useful if you're interested in knowing, like, what are the maximum and minimum longitude and latitude values for the country of Canada, for example. You can do ST-CRS, which extracts the CRS and displays it with the EPSG code, which we just talked about, and the proj4 string, which should both be just different ways of indicating the same CRS. Then you can also do something that's quite useful, which is ST-cast. And basically what this does is if you have something like a multi-polygon, it'll take that multi-polygon and extract out the distinct polygons that make up the multi-polygon. In the book, they used this in order to isolate the islands in a particular state by basically taking the biggest island or finding out which polygon was the biggest island, which was the mainland, and then removing that, leaving therefore only the much smaller actually island parts of the state. There's so many other things you could do. So if this is something that people are really interested in, I would go towards the SF documentation or geocomputation in R to sort of really dig your teeth into this. Lastly, the chapter talked about roster maps. And basically, this is where you, instead of using a vector to indicate the shape of an object, you are actually using an image. So you can do something as similar as like a bitmap file or like a JPEG, but there are also roster image types that are specifically designed for use in geospatial contexts. And these are image formats that include additional metadata that indicate things like the geodetic datum, the coordinate reference system, etc. And these can be used to map the image information onto the surface of the Earth. So a really common example of this type of geospatial roster is the GeoTIFF. And basically it's just a TIFF file, but hidden with, not hidden, but like within the metadata are also the data that you would need in order to give it that spatial context. Most geospatial rosters can be read using SF GDAL read, but there are also a whole bunch of other higher level functions, which the book doesn't talk about, that will do this for you. So very rarely are you actually going to have to call this directly, but just in case anybody is reading in a geospatial roster and they're having issues with those higher level functions, it might be useful to go into this this function. One of the cool things that you can do with roster maps is superimpose a geospatial vector on top of a geospatial roster. So the book's example is having this sort of satellite image taken of the Earth and then being like, oh, there's Australia. I unfortunately did not get this code to work. I was doing this. So I didn't have a lot of time, and so I was doing this within the last like 15 minutes before this meeting started, and just like couldn't get the SatViz data to load in. It was like breaking this file when I tried to knit it. And so I was just like, uh-oh. And therefore, sadly, this is just like a copy and pasted image. I'm going to try to work on getting it to actually work and add in the code examples here.
It could be that your computer was also running out of memory, because something tells me that this is a very heavy raster. I mean, I know that you're getting it from the what's the name of the package again? Stars or something?
Stars, yeah.
But maybe.
Which I had to look into. I haven't fully looked into it, but I had and basically still have no idea what a stars object is.
Yeah, I use Terra when I'm dealing with rasters.
Yeah.
I'm used to doing it with Terra, but I have heard that a lot of people use stars. So I don't know if it's still.
Terra is the one that I'm more familiar with as well. So I looked into it a little bit, and what it says is stars provides infrastructure for data cubes, which are array data with labeled dimensions. So it looks like the usages for it are reading in satellite images, which is what this particular case is, as well as reading in roster time series. So I guess if you had images of a single area over multiple time periods, you could capture all of that in a single stars object.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But this is not something that I've had a chance to play with. And I definitely, when I was reading this chapter, it was just like, ah, yes, stars objects. And I was like, I don't know what that is. So yeah, that is sorry, I've lost there we go. That is the end of this chapter. I don't know, Gabby, did you have any particular questions or things that you wanted to discuss?
So for me, this chapter is super important because I think that in addition to creating graphs, right, like the visual graphs that you're used to, you can also use ggplot to create maps. But I feel like I don't know. I don't think this chapter really conveys that exactly. Like they start talking about, so you're nobody, honest to God, nobody will use, and I don't think you can actually. Nobody's gonna use ggplot to do raster analysis. So then just say that ggplot is not for rasters. If you want to do rasters or map rasters, whatever, then just go to this other book, or we recommend this list of books and these other packages, whatever, right? So I don't know why they went into discussing, and I know it's just a little section, but to me it feels out of place. And then focus your attention more on what you can actually do with ggplot and maps, because I think that it's super cool in the sense that if you want to do a quick map, ggplot is your friend, and you can do something super, super fast, super simple. Let's make it pretty, and this is how you do that. I think that there are other packages that are more powerful if you want to really, really do some spatial analysis. But for something quick and easy, this is your thing. And I feel like they didn't really convey that. So again, I'm a little like.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, I think it's very interesting to know that you can do something like this in ggplot. And maybe this is just, coming from my particular context, but like, I don't know, I just like couldn't think of an example where I would need to do this. And that might just be because like I'm usually using ggplot for a scientific audience, but definitely what I was what was really is more important to me is things like the layered maps and the labeled maps. Like those are things that I think are going to be really useful in just a strict data visualization process and not necessarily in a geospatial analysis.
Yeah, for that, go to a book. But if you want to do, for example, a map and then a little map, this is how you do it. Because that's super useful. We all the time are doing that. Or if you want to combine 3 different maps or 4 or whatever, this is how you do it. I feel like there was a chance to explore that because nobody's gonna do complicated maps in ggplot rasters. Nobody's gonna do that. I did like, however, and I will say that, and you did a beautiful job explaining it, all of with the map projections, for example, and the CRS and the coordinate reference systems. So I appreciate that a lot. So keep that information still there. But then let's go over, all of that. Like, because this is exactly the problem when you're doing any type of maps or any type of mapping. This is where people, me included, we usually do this a lot of errors, or we encounter a lot of like your map and your points are like, here are your points and this is your map. So those are projection issues, right? Or your coordinate system, it's looking super long, or you wanted your point to be in the middle of the state, but then it's like all the way over there. That could also be a CRS problem. And then so show me that kind of thing. And the other thing that I feel like the books, including others that talk about spatial analysis, they don't do a good job at is they tell you this is the projection, and you explain it beautifully, like with the geoids, right? Like this is exactly what's happening and why we need this, blah blah. But then give me examples. Like, so if you're gonna say, so these are, for example, WGS 84 is the most known. But if you encounter NAD 27, NAD 83, these are other examples that you can encounter, and so don't be scared if you see that. This is when you see those names, this is what we're talking about. And then projections that you can talk about UTM, give me examples of that, or you can be talking about lat long, right? These are an example of that. And I feel like those books never put you in context when you're discussing those ideas, and that's where they lose me. But anyway, that's maybe a little bit besides the point. You explained it really, really well. But someone that's a complete newbie will be like, yeah, but how does that look like, right?
Yes, I think it would be really good to have examples where you have a mismatch between your map and your metadata, or which I feel like is probably the most common, like probably I have no data to back this up. I'm just guessing that probably a lot of those issues is that people are probably pulling a map from one place and the data that they want to plot onto the map from another place, and they're not done using the same map projection or the same datum. I know this is definitely an issue that I've had to deal with collecting fossils for museums. Different museums will have different requirements about what projection you're using for your GPS data for where you collected things. So
different countries too, because if you're talking about fossils, maybe Canada uses something, the US is going to use something else, right?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I had to learn a lot was converting lat longs to UTM because of that. And that is in the few cases where I actually have dealt with mapping, that was one of the issues that I had to deal with, was doing that conversion in order to make sure that I could properly map the data that I had. So.
Yeah, exactly. So those common errors are very easy to identify once you have the experience, and easy to fix. So I think that instead of going into other details, like give me that. How do I do that with ggplot? How do I check those things, right? And then but maybe they're improving that chapter in the following sessions. Let's hope. But you explained this really, really well, so I'm very happy about that, because then this recording is gonna look really, really good in the for the next cohort and the future cohorts. They can actually truly watch this video and say, yeah, okay, this is, if I didn't understand it from the book, then they can understand it from you, because it was really, really well explained.
Yeah, I think they explained it pretty well in the book as well. Yeah, I think I definitely think I would have liked to see some more examples of like funkiness that happens with plotting maps.
Yeah.
But
Or
also
for
like
example,
you could
yeah,
probably
like
make a whole book that's just like mapping in ggplot.
that is true. That's true actually. But the other thing is like, yeah, show me more things that I can do with if you're gonna just devote one chapter to maps using ggplot, give me more information because for example, here there are a lot of packages regarding, for example, colors that are specific for maps
Hmm.
for visualizing information on a map.
No.
Show me that, right? Like show me that. Give me some advice, some tips and tricks on how I can. What's the best way to look at uh, color on a map or something? I don't know. Like I feel like it was too basic, and then they go to rasters, which is a super complicated thing.
Yeah.
A little confusing. But I mean, it's good. And I hadn't thought about one thing that you talked about at the beginning, the chord something. Let me see if I can remember.
Oh, the
Wasn't the chord quick map?
yeah.
I like that one. And then there was another thing that I didn't know either.
Was it the
Um,
having multiple geometries?
that one too. Yeah, actually that one too. But then there was another one. Oh, with the projections too, where you can separate that in ST, what was it? One of the ST functions.
Oh yes, it was
Um,
STCRS, like where you can hold just the CRS.
no, 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 no. It was the other one that you talked about, how you can deconstruct the different
Oh,
polygons that
STCast.
are,
Yeah.
yeah, that one. Yeah, that one was super interesting too.
Yeah, I hadn't known about that before either. That
Yeah,
seems
either.
really useful.
Yeah, so thank you, Ashley. This was actually super, super useful. And yeah, super, super useful. I
Yeah.
think, okay, so next week we're gonna go over annotations. We changed the chapters. So we're gonna do annotations, and that one's me. I'm leading that one. And then the following week we're gonna do networks with Kaya, and
Cool.
then arranging plots, if I'm not mistaken. So we have the following weeks already mapped out. So that's it. I'm gonna put stuff in the chat unless you wanna do or say something else.
Nope, all good.
All right. Then